After President Trump nominated a mainstream nominee, Democrats then looked for other ways to make him out to be some sort of extremist or radical. But they failed because there's simply no evidence to justify those kinds of characterizations. For one, judicial experts spanning the political spectrum, including President Obama's former Solicitor General, voiced their support. And second, they had to deal with the facts of his record. During his time on the 10th Circuit, Judge Gorsuch was involved in thousands of decisions, 2,700 to be exact, and the vast majority of those panel decisions made by at least 3 judges, sometimes more on the panel, 97% of them were unanimous. So you would basically have to slander the reputations of all those other judges with whom the judge agreed to claim that he is some sort of out of the mainstream extremist. That's truly an impressive record for a judge in a multi-judge court like the district of the Denver-based 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. And it simply rebuts any picture our friends across the aisle have attempted to paint of him as some kind of extremist or radical. And I would ask our friends this question: if Judge Gorsuch doesn't fit the bill for a qualified mainstream nominee, then is there any nominee from this president or any other Republican president that will meet the Democrats' arbitrary, flimsy standard? Time and time again, our friends across the aisle failed to make any intellectually honest argument against this nominee. And still, they determined to block him. That brought us to the cloture vote yesterday and the last-ditch effort to block Judge Gorsuch. They didn't want to even give him the up or down vote that we're getting ready to have here in a few minutes. Instead, they wanted to kill his nomination by simply refusing an up or down vote and moving his nomination forward. In our nation's entire history, before yesterday, there had only been 4 cloture votes for Supreme Court nominees, only 4. None of them had been cast as a partisan filibuster and determined to try to block the nomination until yesterday. Never dreamed that the Constitution would have allowed for a 60-vote requirement rather than an up or down vote. It's not that our friends across the aisle truly oppose Judge Gorsuch. The fact is they oppose President Trump. That's what this is all about. But this vote isn't actually about President Trump. It's about the man we've all learned so much about, Judge Neil Gorsuch, who has a record of faithfully interpreting the law, a man who's proven himself to possess an independent judicial mind, who simply follows the law wherever it may lead, and someone who's won bipartisan approval. This vote is about delivering on a promise. Republicans promised to let the American people let their voice be heard in deciding who they would choose as president to select the next Supreme Court justice. The American people did that. They chose President Trump, and he chose Judge Gorsuch. If Hillary Clinton had been elected president today, I have no doubt that her choice for the Supreme Court would be confirmed by a majority vote in the same United States Senate. So now it's time we deliver on the promise that we made to the American people and confirm Judge Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court. Madam President, I yield the floor.
President.
Democratic Whip.
Madam President, I hadn't planned to speak this morning, but when my friend from Texas decided to give his version of history, I thought, well, maybe I ought to add my version. It's slightly different. Justice Antonin Scalia passed away in February of last year. President Barack Obama, President of the United States of America, had a constitutional responsibility under Article 2, Section 2, to nominate a person to fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court, as every other president had, and he did. He came up with the name Merrick Garland, the chief judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, a man who was widely respected, judged unanimously well qualified by the American Bar Association. And President Obama submitted his name to this Congress, to this Senate, a Senate which is with a Republican majority and a leader, Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky. Senator McConnell and the Republican senators did something that had never happened in the history of this chamber, not once. They denied to President Obama's nominee the opportunity for a hearing and a vote. In fact, Senator McConnell went further and said, I won't even meet with the man. It had never happened before. And you say to yourself, well, come on, this isn't beanbag, you're in Washington. This is major league politics. This sort of thing must happen all the time. Never. In fact, if you go back not that far in history to 1988, in the last year of President Ronald Reagan's presidency, his fourth year, some call it the lame duck year, there was a vacancy on the Supreme Court. Republican President Ronald Reagan sent the name Anthony Kennedy to a democratically controlled Senate, which had the power to do the same thing Senator McConnell did, deny a hearing, deny a vote. Well, what did the Democrats do? They gave to Justice Kennedy a hearing, a vote, and sent him to fill the vacancy in the Supreme Court. The Republicans under Senator McConnell refused Merrick Garland the same opportunity, and they said to President Obama, you're in your fourth year. You're a lame duck. Your choice for the Supreme Court really doesn't count. But there was more to it. Really, the strategy was based on the premise and possibility that a Republican would be elected in this last November election. And if so, that Republican president could fill the vacancy on the Supreme Court. Well, that's exactly what happened. The election of Donald Trump gave him the opportunity to fill the vacancy of Antonin Scalia, a vacancy which should have been filled, I believe, by Merrick Garland, President Obama's nominee. That's what led up to the vote yesterday. But there was more. Where did the name Neil Gorsuch come from? It's true. He served on the 10th Circuit for 10 years. He'd been approved by the United States Senate. He certainly had a strong resume. But how did he get on the finalist list? Well, most of the time, you never know. Presidents don't always disclose how they come up with names, but in this case, it was very open. Because during the course of his campaign, Donald Trump, the candidate, listed 21 names of people that he would appoint to the U.S. Supreme Court. On that list of names, Neil Gorsuch of Colorado. How did that name make the list? Well, we know, because President Trump told us. He was the choice of the Federalist Society and the Heritage Foundation. If you know these two organizations, you know that they are Republican advocacy groups, very conservative groups, and they were going to pick the nominees that were approved by them and submit them to Donald Trump, which he then publicized. We know that because at the end of the day, Donald Trump thanked the Federalist Society for nominating Judge Gorsuch. That's how his name came to us. Now, I sat through the hearings as a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and I will tell you that most Supreme Court nominees don't go out of their way to volunteer information. They try to be respectful, but they don't try to say much of anything. They don't want to get in trouble, either as judges or as candidates to be a judge on the U.S. Supreme Court. And so there were gaps in his testimony and questions raised about him. But I don't want to dwell on him so much as I want to dwell on this process. What happened yesterday on the floor of the United States Senate was unfortunate. The last 4 justices on the Supreme Court, 2 nominated by President Obama, Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, 2 nominated by George W. Bush, John Roberts, as well as Justice Alito, all received 60 votes during the course of their consideration. That is not, as the senator from Texas alluded, written in the law per se, but it was written until yesterday into the rules of the Senate. You needed 60 votes to overcome the possibility of a filibuster and to file cloture. Well, that rule was changed yesterday to a majority. That's an unfortunate occurrence. A lifetime appointment to the highest court on the land should be more than just a bare majority vote, as far as I'm concerned. And historically, with very few exceptions, that has been the case. That is not the case here. We found yesterday a change in the rules, which was under the power of the majority to do, a change in the rules which lowered the standard for this judge for the first time officially in at least a century to a mere majority vote. That's what he received, and that's what brings his nomination to the floor today to be considered for the Supreme Court. At the end of yesterday's session, when the rule was changed, some senators were engaged in high fives on the other side of the aisle. I'm not sure why. I don't think it was a time for any winning celebration. I think it was an unfortunate moment. And the question is, where will we go from here? We know what the outcome of the vote will be on Judge Gorsuch this afternoon. That's preordained by the rule struggle that we went through yesterday. But where does the Senate go? Where should we go? Well, I hope that we'll have the good sense to restore the 60-vote margin when it comes to future Supreme Court nominees. It may mean that Justice Gorsuch has an asterisk by his name as the only one to have been officially approved with a majority vote, but I'm hoping, even if he reaches the Supreme Court, that won't hold him back from serving this nation well. I know he's told us over and over again that's exactly what he wants to do. But I would hope that the Senate would restore the standard of 60 votes necessary for the Supreme Court. I really believe that this is an extraordinary opportunity for a person to serve this nation, an extraordinary responsibility, and we should take it very seriously. It shouldn't be a majority decision, it should be a 60-vote decision, and I hope we get back to that very soon. Secondly, I hope that the Senate will not be derailed by this Supreme Court nomination having happened so early in this session. This is a great institution. I've given a big part of my life to it and look forward to serving more in this Senate, not as long as the senator from Iowa, who I think has retired the trophy in his state for his service in the United States Senate. But I do believe that this is a great institution. An example is the senator from Iowa, opposite political faith. He and I have worked together on some important issues in the past, and we want to work together in the future. And I think we can. And if we can, and restore what you and I remember as the glory days of this body, it's in the best interest of this nation. So beyond this Supreme Court nomination, let's hope that we can all come together to make that happen. I see my colleagues filing in, and I know they're anxious, many of them, to vote, and I'm not going to hold the chamber. I'm just going to say that I thank the presiding officer and my friend, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Look forward to the vote. I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
We're about to vote on the nomination of Judge Gorsuch. So I would like to say to my colleagues why I'm so pleased that we'll soon be referring to him as Justice Gorsuch. I opened our Judiciary Committee hearing with this. As Justice Scalia said, it is, quote, the proud boast of our democracy that we have a government of law and not man. Without a secure structure of separated powers, our Bill of Rights would be worthless. End of Scalia's quote. The separation of powers in our Constitution is the guardian of our liberty. Judge Gorsuch understands that. His deep understanding of the separation of powers enlivens his opinions. By faithfully enforcing the boundaries among the branches of government and the power of the federal government in our lives, this justice will ensure that the law protects our liberties. And here's the other thing that's important about a judge who respects the separation of powers. We know that he'll be independent. He told us that he is his own man, that no person speaks for him. He's not beholden to the president who appointed him. And his testimony shows that he's not beholden to us in the Congress either. He wouldn't compromise his independence to win confirmation votes. He passed the test. This is a man of integrity, and his qualifications for the bench are exceptional. You know the story. Columbia University, bachelor's, Harvard Law School, doctorate, Oxford University, partnership at a prestigious law firm, and high-level Justice Department service for the people of our country. But most importantly, a decade-long record of faithfully applying the law on the federal bench in 2,700 cases as a member of the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals. So let me sum up this way. This brilliant, honest, humble man is a judge's judge, and he will make a superb justice. I yield the floor. I suggest a lack of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Assistant Democratic Leader.
I ask consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And Mr. President, I yield back the balance of our time on this side. I withhold that request until the arrival of the leader.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I ask consent that further procedures on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Yield back the balance of time on this side.
Without objection, all time is yielded back. The question occurs on the confirmation of Neil M. Gorsuch of Colorado to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States.
For the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Strange, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Capito, Collins, Cornyn, Crapo, Daines, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hatch, Heller, Johnson, Kennedy, McConnell, Moran, Murkowski, Perdue, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Scott, Strange, Sullivan, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, Young. Senators voting in the negative: Cardin, Casey, Duckworth, Durbin, Harris, Heinrich, Kane, Leahy, Murray, Reed. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Cochran. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Langford. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, no. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley, no. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Menendez, no. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. McCain, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Franken, no. Mr. Udall, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. King, no. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow. No. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein. No. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar. No.
Okay. 54. Is first. Thank you. As a reminder, expressions of approval or disapproval are not permitted from the gallery. Is there any senator who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, On this vote, the ayes are 54, the nays are 45. The nomination of Neil M. Gorsuch of Colorado to be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States is confirmed.
Mr. President,
Majority Leader.
I move to reconsider the vote, and I move to table a motion to reconsider.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is tabled.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appears to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 34, Rob Rosenstein, to be Deputy Attorney General.
Question is on the motion. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appears to have it. They do have it. The motion is agreed to.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
Clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, Department of Justice, Rod J. Rosenstein of Maryland to be Deputy Attorney General.
I sent a cloture motion to the desk.
I thought I already did that. To the desk.
Clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Rod J. Rosenstein of Maryland to be Deputy Attorney General, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the cloture motion be waived, that notwithstanding the provisions of Rule 22, the cloture vote on the nomination occur following disposition of the Purdue nomination on Monday, April 24th.
Without objection. The senator from Iowa, and the chamber will be in order.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think there's some people that need to have a thank you for what we just completed here, people that hardly ever get any attention, and to thank them. So I take a couple of minutes to express my appreciation to some of the staff who worked on this Supreme Court nomination. Staff for both the majority and minority put in a lot of hours and reviewed a lot of material. Their work ensured that the hearing we held for Judge Gorsuch went smoothly and was fair to all the members.
The Senate will be in order.
Our staff reviewed all of the 2,700 cases Judge Gorsuch participated in. You want me to wait, Mr. President?
The senator will suspend. Could senators please take their conversations out of the chamber? The senator from Iowa. The Senate will be in order.
Going back to my thank yous, our staff reviewed all 2,700 cases Judge Gorsuch participated in, as well as 180,000 pages of documents produced by the Department of Justice and the George W. Bush Library related to that nomination. So first on my staff, I'd like to recognize my Judiciary Committee Staff Director, Colin Davis. Mr. Davis has been with me for 31 years, and I always value his wise counsel. My personal office Chief of Staff, Jill Cosney, who has been with me for 27 years as well. My Deputy Staff Director is Rita Lara, and my Chief Nomination Counsel is right here at my side, Ted Lehman. I'd also like to thank Consuls Megan Lacey, Lauren Mailer, Casey O'Connor, and Catherine Willey. Each of them worked incredibly hard. Also on the team were several special consuls who joined the staff to work on this important nomination. They are Dan Guanera, Bill Lane, Katie Roholt, and Carol Zurkowski. Every one of these talented lawyers played a very important role, and I think every member of the Senate Judiciary Committee benefited from their wise counsel throughout this confirmation process. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank Ranking Member Feinstein, Senator from California. The Ranking Member and her staff approached this process seriously from the very beginning. So I want to thank her staff for all of the work that they put into preparing for the hearing and the debate, both in committee and here on the floor. Thank you to her staff director, Jennifer Duck, and several of the other lawyers on her staff who I know put a lot of time into ensuring the hearing was a success. They include Paige Herwig, Naseen Mehta, and Chan Park. I'm also thankful to my very talented press team, Beth Levine and Taylor Foy, and to Jen Hine for keeping me on schedule, and to my personal office staff and the rest of the Judiciary Committee staff who took care of things while I was on the floor and during the long hours in the hearing. I also deeply appreciate the work of Senator McConnell's staff, who was constantly in contact with my staff, most importantly, John Abeg. The people I mentioned bore the bulk of the workload, laboring tirelessly night after night, day after day, and nonstop through the weekends. They deserve our recognition as a tribute to their hard work, professionalism, and dedication to public service. Finally, my thanks to the Judiciary Committee's Chief Clerk, Rosalind Turner, and her team, Michelle Heller and Jason Covey. All of these staff members contributed to this process, and we wouldn't have been able to conduct such a fair and thorough hearing without their hard work and their professionalism. To each of them, I extend a heartfelt thanks, and if I left anybody out, I'll buy him a Dairy Queen. Finally, my wife, Barbara, is in the Capitol today. As always, I thank her for her support and partnership for more than 62 years. I yield the floor, and I guess go ahead.
The senator from Colorado.
Mr. President, I want to thank Chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee for the work that he carried out over the past several months as this nomination proceeded. But mostly, I want to congratulate Judge Neil Gorsuch on his confirmation to the United States Supreme Court. While people in this chamber voted yay or nay, some voted yes, some voted no, we all recognize the heavy obligation that now falls on the shoulders of Judge Gorsuch as a justice of the United States Supreme Court. We will lean on Judge Gorsuch to make sure that our Constitution is enforced. The American people will lean on Judge Gorsuch to make sure that justice is dispensed impartially, equality, that justice is indeed blind. And so, to Judge Gorsuch and his family, congratulations. To the people of this chamber who worked so hard over the past several weeks and months to assure this moment happened, thank you. And for the great state of Colorado, it's an honor to have a fourth-generation Coloradan, a man of the West, grit and determination, join the nation's high court. Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. Chairman, Mr. President, I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Nebraska.
I ask unanimous consent that we suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'd like to thank you personally for spelling me in the chair in lieu of the president for just a moment. I'd like to add my voice to yours in commending the chairman of the Judiciary Committee the senator from Iowa, just for the honorable, principled, and common sense way in which he's led this committee through the last number of weeks and months as he shepherded the confirmation of Monday, Justice Gorsuch through this body. The chairman from Iowa is a special man, and the 100 of us, or the 99 of us who are privileged and blessed to serve with him, know that he's the model of how to conduct yourself honorably in this job, and America will benefit from Justice Gorsuch joining the court, and I'd just like to add my voice to those commending the senior senator from Iowa for the way he's helped shepherd this body. Thank you.
Mr. President.
The majority leader.
Are we in a quorum call?
We are not.
Mr. President, I'm proud to say the Senate has now confirmed Judge Neil Gorsuch as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. I want to congratulate Judge Gorsuch on this significant achievement. We look forward to observing his good work in the years to come. The confirmation process was certainly a significant undertaking, one that wouldn't have been possible without the dedicated efforts of so many. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize them now. First, I'd like to thank the man who made this moment possible by sending us this outstanding nominee. That's our president, Donald Trump. This has been one of the most transparent judicial nomination processes anybody can.
The majority leader will suspend. Will be in order. The Senate will be in order. The majority leader.
This has been one of the most transparent judicial nomination processes anybody can remember, and President Trump should be commended for his efforts. I also appreciate the role Vice President Pence played in moving this nomination forward, as well as the outstanding work of the White House staff led by Don McGahn for the wise counsel they provided throughout this process. Now, of course, we all know how tirelessly our dear friend Senator Grassley has worked in leading the Judiciary Committee through this process. He's been an unwavering leader, though we know it hasn't always been easy. Chairman Grassley worked long and hard to ensure this process ran efficiently, to give members on both sides ample opportunity to review the nomination, to see that the nominee was treated respectfully, and ultimately to help bring this well-qualified jurist over the finish line. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention the work of the Judiciary Committee collectively for its time and effort as well. I'm referring to members of the committee, and I'm referring to Chairman Grassley's excellent judiciary staff as well. They were critical to this effort, and specifically I want to thank the following: Staff Director Colin Davis, Chief Nominations Counsel Ted Lehman, Communications Director Beth Levine, Megan Lacey, Lauren Mailer, Casey O'Connor, Catherine Wiley, Bill Lane, Carl Zurkowski, Dan Warnerl, and Katie Roholt. To that end, I also like to acknowledge our former colleague Kelly Ayotte. From dozens of meetings with senators to lengthy days-long hearings, she helped ensure this process ran as smoothly as possible, and she did so with a sense of grace we all came to know when she was one of our colleagues. Similarly, I want to recognize several White House Legislative Affairs staff who helped guide Judge Gorsuch through this process, including Mary Elizabeth Taylor, Mark Short, and Amy Swanger. There are several others I'd like to thank now as well. To the floor staff, Laura Dove, Robert Duncan, and their team, thank you for keeping the floor running smoothly and guiding us through Senate procedure. You all do incredible work. very difficult work, and you make it look effortless during each and every time. To the folks who keep our institution running, the parliamentarians, the clerks, the reporters of debates, doorkeepers, Capitol Police, and numerous others who sacrificed and worked long, often grueling hours, thank you for everything you do and for always doing it with a smile. Of course, I'd also like to thank my Republican colleagues for their months of hard work. It's been a winding and sometimes bumpy road, but together we were able to confirm a judge who I believe will serve his country very well. In particular, let me thank Republican Whip John Cornyn and his team led by Monica Popp for their efforts. Theirs is certainly not an easy job, but it's a necessary one. Now, there are a few others I couldn't leave today without mentioning. To each and every member of my own staff, I want to express my sincere appreciation. There are almost too many names to mention, but if I may, I'd like to acknowledge a few individuals who've been particular assets through this entire process. My Chief of Staff, Sharon Soderstrom. Sharon led our team through this lengthy and arduous confirmation process while balancing a never-ending list of demands. She's been a constant source of support and, as always, an indisputable and fearless leader. Sharon, I'm immensely grateful to you for being at the helm of my leadership office. My Deputy Chief, Don Stewart. Stu, as we like to call him, always knows exactly what to say or not to say, as the case may be. He's been a critical member of the team in charting the way forward and in helping convey our efforts to the American people. Stu, thank you for your discerning advice and, yes, for your good humor as well. My Policy Director, Hazen Marshall. Hazen has steered our policy objectives forward, balancing numerous legislative items, making it look effortless along the way. So thanks, Hazen, for your sound counsel and for driving the train forward on so many different issues. And my counsel, John Abegg. Where do I begin? John has been an invaluable member of my team, a guiding source of wisdom, and a driving force in bringing Judge Gorsuch over the finish line. He's put in countless hours. He's never stopped working, even in the most trying of times. John, literally, this moment would not have been possible without you. I know there are many others who I wasn't able to name right now, but I want them to know that we recognize your efforts and we're immeasurably grateful for the work you do. I suggest that to the quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.